The Stalingrad creature. The winter of 1942 in Stalingrad was like no other. German Corporal Heinrich Weber stood ankle-deep in snow, his breath clouding the icy air as he looked over the desolate ruins of what was once a vibrant city. Now it was a graveyard, a battlefield torn apart by relentless artillery fire, where life and death merged into one frozen nightmare. The cold gnawed at his bones, but the gnawing hunger was worse. His stomach had been empty for days. The German Sixth Army had been cut off, surrounded by the Soviets, and supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. Heinrich's comrades shuffled like ghosts in their tattered uniforms, faces pale and hollow. The wind howled through the broken buildings, carrying with it a distant, eerie sound, gunfire, screams, and something else, something he couldn't place, a low growl like a wounded animal far off in the snow-covered wasteland. Corpses littered the ground around him, a grim reminder of the endless battles fought in this forsaken place. But something strange had been happening. Some of the bodies, both German and Soviet, were vanishing. At first, Heinrich assumed it was the cold. Perhaps they were buried under fresh snowdrifts, or maybe the enemy had taken them to scavenge supplies. But the disappearances became more frequent, more unsettling. One morning, a group of soldiers who had died in the trenches were gone, their frozen bloodstains the only trace of their existence. Rumors spread through the ranks. Soldiers whispered of something else out there in the cold, something that neither side could explain. At night, Heinrich would lie in the remnants of a bombed-out building, listening. The normal sounds of war, the sporadic gunfire, the distant thunder of artillery, were punctuated by something unnatural. The growl was there again, faint but unmistakable, followed by cries for help. Sometimes the voices were in Russian, sometimes German, and they always came from the darkness. One night it happened again. Heinrich was on patrol with a few others when a scream cut through the frozen air, sharp and terrified. It was close, too close. "Help me! For God's sake, help!" It was one of their own, a young soldier named Dieter, who had been keeping watch just a few meters ahead. Heinrich and the others ran toward the sound, but when they arrived, Dieter was gone. His rifle lay in the snow, still warm from his hands. But there was no sign of struggle, no footprints, nothing. Panic set in. More soldiers started disappearing, not just from Heinrich's unit, but from the Soviets too. At first, the commanders dismissed the disappearances as desertion or miscommunication in the chaos of war. But as days passed and more men vanished without a trace, even the officers couldn't ignore the truth. Something was taking them. One evening, as the remaining men huddled around a makeshift fire, trying to stave off the freezing cold, they heard it again. This time it was different. The growl was deep, guttural, and close. Then came the gunfire, wild and frantic. But it wasn't directed at them. It was coming from the Soviets, somewhere beyond the destroyed buildings that separated their lines. Heinrich and his comrades listened, horrified, as the sounds of gunfire turned into screams, agonized, desperate cries for help in Russian. "What the hell is it?" one of the soldiers muttered, his voice trembling. No one answered. They were all thinking the same thing. The Soviets were as terrified as they were. But of what? Over the next few days, it became clear. Something was hunting them all. Heinrich's squad found evidence of a struggle near one of the Soviet outposts, ripped clothing, discarded weapons, and deep gouges in the snow, as if something had been dragged away. Then they found blood. Too much blood for anyone to have survived. But there were no bodies. The fear was consuming them. Some of the men were so frightened they wanted to desert, to risk the Soviets' wrath just to get away from whatever was out there in the endless white. But there was nowhere to run. They were trapped in Stalingrad, surrounded by enemies, with something worse lurking in the shadows. One bitterly cold night, the horror reached its peak. A barrage of artillery shook the ground, the sky lighting up with fiery explosions. Heinrich and his squad huddled in their trench as the earth trembled beneath them. When the shelling stopped, an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. But something was different. The growl was gone. The next morning, as the soldiers cautiously ventured out to survey the damage, they found it. Near a crater where an artillery shell had exploded, something lay half buried in the snow. At first glance, they thought it was a man, but as they approached, they realized it was nothing human. The creature was pale, its skin a sickly, almost translucent white. It stood over 7 feet tall, even in death, with limbs that were too long, too thin. Its fingers were grotesquely elongated, tipped with razor-sharp claws that had torn through flesh and bone. Its face was frozen in a snarl, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, and its eyes, black, empty pits, stared lifelessly up at the gray sky. Heinrich felt a wave of nausea. This was the thing that had been stalking them, the predator that had turned the battlefield into its hunting grounds. Its body was riddled with shrapnel, a victim of the same artillery that had been meant for the Soviets. But even in death, it exuded a terrible presence. One of the soldiers bent down to inspect it closer, his voice shaky. "What the hell is this thing?" No one answered. No one knew. As they stood there staring at the creature that had terrorized them for weeks, the distant sound of gunfire echoed across the ruined city. War was still raging, but in that moment, Heinrich realized the horror they had faced was something far worse than any enemy soldier. The beast may have been dead, but its legacy of fear would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Whatever it was, it had come out of the darkest depths of this frozen hell, and Heinrich knew as he looked out over the snow-covered wasteland of Stalingrad that they were not the first to encounter such horror, and they would not be the last.